Welcome to The Disciplined Life. I'm Aria.
And I'm Coda.
We use our experience as a married couple living in a domestic discipline marriage to talk about the ups and downs of implementing authority structure and domestic discipline into modern relationships.
Let's do it.
Hello everyone. Had to use Coda's line there because he is not with me today. But on today's podcast, we are going to be talking about signs that you're doing discipline wrong. But before we get into that, if you're not already, please do subscribe, like this video, leave it a comment. It really does help boost us in the algorithm, helps us get more reach, all those good things. If you like what we do and want to support us further, a link to our Patreon is down below. And without further ado, let's get into this topic. So I think before we get into this topic of signs that discipline isn't going well or that you're doing discipline wrong, it's important to acknowledge that discipline is not a one-size-fits-all. There are so many ways to do discipline within a domestic discipline relationship, and it really depends on what works best for the couple, for their circumstance, what works best for the taken in hand to get the results you want. And so there's not a singular one-size-fits-all when it comes to discipline. There isn't a requirement for you to use certain implements or use certain types of discipline for you to have a healthy domestic discipline relationship. And so it's important to acknowledge, like, hey, I'm not telling you that what you're doing is wrong. It's more of signs that what you're doing isn't getting the results that you want and is causing maybe some issues in your relationship. And if that's happening, then you really do need to look at what you're doing and decide how you are going to course correct in order to get the results that you do want and to get the relationship results that you want as well, the behavior results and the relationship results. So some signs that things aren't going well in your discipline, first and foremost, is if you're not seeing behavior change. The whole point of having a domestic discipline relationship, having an authority structure to your relationship, having a head of household lead the relationship, having the taken in hand come under that leadership and be accountable to the head of household, is to change and shape behavior, right? I think that most of us came into this relationship structure or are looking into this relationship structure because we see pain points in our relationship, and especially we see behaviors that are happening in our relationship that we want to see change. So if you are implementing discipline and those behaviors aren't changing, that's a sign that your discipline isn't working and you might be approaching it the wrong way. And so just keep that in mind, that really behavior is going to be the best indicator of how your discipline is going. Another sign that discipline's not going well for you is if the taken in hand becomes withdrawn. Maybe the behavior's changing and you're seeing really good results, but they're becoming a shell of themselves. They're withdrawing within themselves. They are becoming very trepidatious around their head of household. Maybe they're becoming anxious or easily overwhelmed, or they're really afraid of making a mistake. You know, there is a certain level of, dread that comes upon me when I know I've made a mistake, but I don't have this like fear of making a mistake. I know that mistakes happen and there are opportunities to learn. But if you have a taken in hand that is just so fearful of action because they're afraid that any action they take could lead to a mistake that would then lead to a punishment, that becomes something that you want to take a look at. That is a red flag for discipline maybe being done the wrong way, or just discipline not working in that scenario. So really take a look at, even if behavior is changing, if you're taken in hand all of a sudden is just like not as personable, not as warm and engaged in the relationship, and they just start to withdraw and start to become very anxious and fearful, that's definitely something to pay attention to. Again, and this kind of goes along with that, if you notice that there's increased like stress and tension within the relationship, that is an indication that discipline's not going right, that maybe something's going wrong within how you're approaching discipline, how you're approaching your relationship. Is if there is more stress between the both of you, if there's more tension, if there's maybe even more arguments, then something's not going right with the discipline or with your relationship, more so. But I'm really talking about like if you have a relationship that was good, you're starting on a good foundation, and the only difference is now you've incorporated domestic discipline and you're starting to see more tension in the relationship. Discipline and having this hierarchical structure really should eliminate or decrease the tension, decrease the arguments. It really shouldn't be an increase. And so if you are seeing that increase, that is definitely a sign that you need to evaluate how you're approaching discipline and what's going on. And then the last sign that I'm going to cover, there's obviously more. If you can think of other signs that discipline isn't going right within a relationship, leave those in the comments. I would love to hear other perspectives on this. But the last sign that I'm going to cover is a decrease of communication. If you start to notice that there's less communication in your relationship, maybe that's part of maybe the taken hand withdrawing more, is that they stop talking, they stop communicating, they aren't as open. And if you as the head of household, as the leader, are not communicating and you're not talking through things with your taken in hand, that really can lead to a breakdown of the relationship, and that can lead to a breakdown of discipline. Because when you are in a domestic discipline relationship, you really do need to have more communication, more vulnerability. And so if you're seeing a lack of communication, then you really do need to, again, step back, reevaluate what's going on. So where you may be going wrong, you might be not really understanding the concept of consent and negotiation. I think that this is more common when people are starting their domestic discipline relationships. It might happen within like an established domestic discipline relationship too, but I think it's more common when you're first starting out. I think that there's this desire for taken in hands, especially, to have a strong leader within their head of household, to where they no longer have to communicate and they no longer have to make any decisions, and they can just kind of exist in this space, and that their head of household is just going to come in, swoop in, and just make all the rules and offer all the accountability. But they forget that they have a responsibility to communicate, to negotiate. And on the flip side, a head of household may look at domestic discipline and he may say, okay, so in domestic discipline, I am the head of household, I am the leader, I have ultimate authority in this relationship. And while that is somewhat true, you have a responsibility to understand your taken in hands limits and to communicate with them so that you know what those limits are and you can honor their limits and ask for their input so that you understand what they do and do not consent to, so that you can make decisions within that. And I think that it's really important to understand, like, there are certain punishments that Coda and I don't use explicitly because I don't consent to it. There are certain punishments that we don't use because Coda does not consent to using that. Again, we use spanking, but there are certain implements that we don't use because one or both of us have a limit around that particular implement. And so even within a hierarchical structure, even within like this authority dynamic, there is consent, there is negotiation, there is communication, so that the head of household can effectively lead while honoring the taken in hands uh, limits and their consent. And that is one really fast way to break down your relationship, is to not communicate and not understand that your taken in hand has ongoing consent in this relationship, and that you don't have ultimate authority to impose just any punishment that you want, that you really do need to be considerate of the circumstance and of what is and is not acceptable within your relationship. And if you don't do that, that really can just get things to a really bad place really quickly. So that would be where I would start, is make sure that you understand the roles of a head of household, the role of a taken in hand, and the importance of consent and negotiation, and understand where everybody's limits are and what needs to be done within those. The second way that you could be unintentionally causing issues within your relationship is by trying to obtain unrealistic goals. I know that for myself, I have a really high standard for myself, and sometimes it's frustrating to me that Coda doesn't hold me to as high of a standard that I hold myself. But I realize that he doesn't, because my goals for myself are unrealistic, and if he imposed those on me as a head of household, that would be unfair. And so you really do want to evaluate, what are the goals that we're working on, where are we at right now, and is it realistic to put certain standards in place? Are the goals that we want to achieve, are those realistic? And if so, then are there steps to get there? Or do we need to just set those standards right now? But understand, like, no one is perfect. No one's ever going to be perfect. And you really do need to evaluate if the standards that you're imposing on your taken in hand is something that they're capable of obtaining, if it's something that they're capable of achieving. And so if you are coming in and you're saying, we're doing this domestic discipline thing now, I'm the head of household, I'm the authority, so this is what you will and will not do, and it's things that are like a full 180 from what they're currently doing, and it's well-established habits, they're going to fall. They're going to slip up time and time again, and you need to make those changes gradually, if they're changes that need to be made at all. And maybe you really reevaluate where you're setting that bar. And so just make sure that the goals you have are obtainable and realistic, because if they're not, then you're setting your taken in hand up for failure, to the point where they may even feel like that you're setting them up to fail on purpose. And that can really break down the relationship aspect of your domestic discipline. And so definitely make sure that your goals are realistic. Another way that you might be unintentionally causing issues in your relationship and the breakdown of your domestic discipline is by being too harsh in how you approach punishments. We want to be careful, because every taken in hand is going to require a different level of severity of punishment. Some taken in hands do require a heavy hand to have that cleansing, corrective spanking, right? And some taken in hands require a lighter hand. You don't want to be over the top or harsh with your taken in hand. So unfortunately, I can't give like a very clear guideline of what that looks like, because it is going to be different for everybody. And so you do have to kind of trial and error out until you find that sweet spot. But if you are regularly just being very harsh with your taken in hand, and you are making it to where you want to get them to the point where they don't want to repeat the behavior, where they want the spanking to be over, where they regret their decision that led them there, that they are wishing that the spanking would be over already. You want to get them to that point, but you don't want to cross the line into just being torturous. You don't want to cross that line into causing actual harm. I always say that spanking is not an exercise of physical endurance. And so if you're approaching every spanking with that in mind, that could be breaking down the respect that your taken in hand has for you and could be causing more relationship damage than it is benefit. Because at the end of the day, you need to make sure that your taken in hand is taken care of and that you're using discipline to shape their behavior and for their betterment, not just to impose a physical consequence on them. Again, situation and circumstance matters, so there may be times where a harsher spanking is appropriate, but if you're going into every spanking, every little mistake, just with the intention to absolutely put them through an exercise of endurance and cause the most amount of physical pain possible, that's would probably be too harsh for most, if not all, taken in hands. And just a line that you really want to look and see, am I crossing that line into just being torturous with how I'm approaching punishment? Am I punishing them for their own good, or am I punishing them just to put them through the physical aspect of receiving pain? And definitely take a look at that, because being too harsh can cause some major issues. On the flip side, being too lenient in how you approach punishment can cause some issues too. And I think that most people that I've talked to, this is where they kind of fall, is most taken in hands that have had issues with how their head of household approaches punishment. It's because the head of household doesn't necessarily want to be harsh. They don't want to cross that line, and so they end up erring on the side of leniency. And you don't want to be too lenient either, because if your spankings are not hard enough to cause your taken in hand to get to that place of regret and remorse and wishing that the spanking was over, then it's not going to be corrective. And if your spankings are too short, then you're not going to get them to a place of really emotional cleansing and getting to that place where they are ready and willing to come under submission of your authority again. And so in order for spanking to be effective, it has to be long, it has to be hard, but it can't be too long or too hard that you cross that line into being torturous or being harsh. And so again, this is something that you're really going to have to communicate a lot about. When Coda and I first started our domestic discipline, after every single spanking, either later that night or the next day, we would talk to each other and I would give my feedback. I would say, I felt like it was too short, or I felt like you didn't get quite to the level where I was really regretful of my actions. And I was able to give that feedback to him objectively. You taken in hands out there, if you are in a position where you're being asked to give this feedback, do not let emotion or criticism come into play. You want to be objective but honest about what you need from the discipline. And head of households, I would encourage you to ask for that feedback and maybe even create a system of a punishment journal. So every time there is a punishment, your taken in hand can journal through why the punishment happened and how they felt like the punishment went, and then go in and read it just as a way to gather information. And again, unless they're being disrespectful, don't punish them for their perspective of how your punishment went. But it may be appropriate sometimes to do a do-over. And we've done that before too, where I told Coda, I was like, look, I don't feel like the punishment really did what it was supposed to do, and I would feel a lot better if we tried again. And so doing a do-over is an option if the punishment really just did not meet the mark. but you want to be in constant communication so that you can eventually learn where that sweet spot is, because now Coda and I hardly ever have to have those conversations because we have figured out what is an effective punishment, what are the body language signs that he can look for to know if once he's reached that point of me being very regretful and very remorseful for my actions. And then he can kind of sit in that space for just a little bit so that he doesn't cross over into being too harsh, but that it really drives home the point and gets the point across. The next way that you might be unintentionally causing these issues is not being consistent. We have talked so many times about the importance of consistency, and it really can't be understated that consistency really is the key to making domestic discipline work. And the easiest way to undermine your discipline is to be inconsistent. And the fastest way to establish your authority and to establish discipline is to establish consistency. Now, if you're overwhelmed with your rules, if you're overwhelmed with the amount of things that you need to keep track of in order to keep track of your taken in hand, simplify. That's the answer there, is instead of having a list of every single rule itemized out, maybe simplify it into standards. You know, if they have rules about housework, instead of itemizing every single housework task that they do, simplify it into that they're responsible for the upkeep of the home. And then if they start to fall short in an area, you can point it out, you can give them a warning, give them time to catch up. And if they don't, then you can punish them. If you have a standard that you want them to be responsible, then, you know, if they are running late or if they make you late to an appointment, then they can be punished for that because being tardy is irresponsible. If that's something they struggle with, then that's definitely something that you want to, you know, implement a rule about. But instead of the rule being you need to be on time, say you need to be responsible. And part of being responsible is being on time to appointments that we've made or events that we go to. And so by simplifying the way you approach rules, it allows you to be consistent easier, because now instead of keeping track of an itemized list in every interaction that doesn't sit right with you, you're going through your list and trying to figure out, did that click off any rule? Was any rule broken there? Because I don't feel good about what just happened here. You can instead say, okay, I don't feel good about what happened here. Does it fall into any of our core values? And if not, then don't punish for it necessarily, depending on what it is, but have a conversation and say, this didn't sit right with me. It doesn't fall into any of these core values. So maybe we need to add a core value here that this would cover. Because as a head of household, it is okay for you to evaluate what's going on. And if you don't like what's going on, it is absolutely within your power to impose rules and values to change those things. But by simplifying it into values rather than an itemized list of rules, it's easier for you to be consistent and to address things and punish things more consistently. And that's really important. And the last way that I'm going to cover, and again, if you guys have any thoughts or feedback on this, I would love to know. What are some of the things that you have seen in relationships or in your own relationship or other relationships that really break down the authority structure? I would love to know. But the last thing I'm going to cover is not understanding the difference between a head of household and a disciplinarian. This is a big one, because on this podcast, we talk about lifestyle domestic discipline. And what that means is that we talk about domestic discipline within relationships, typically long-term committed relationships. Coda and I are married. Most of the people that we talk to are married or on their way to becoming married. And so when you are in a domestic discipline relationship, when you are in a lifestyle domestic discipline relationship where you are a head of household, that your role is so much more than a disciplinarian. A head of household does discipline their taken in hand, but that's not all they do. And so when you are taking on that role of disciplinarian and foregoing the rest of what it means to be a head of household, that can really cause your taken in hand to feel trepidatious around you, to feel like you are always watching them and trying to see when they're going to mess up. And that can cause a lot of anxiety, that can cause a lot of withdrawing, that can cause a lot of the issues that we talked about earlier. And so what you really need to do is you need to understand that as a head of household, your job is more than just being the disciplinarian. As a head of household, you can see the circumstances, you can see the situations, right? You can take all those things into account. You can also approach your relationship as not only a disciplinarian, but you are their leader, their protector, their guide. And so you really want to approach your relationship understanding that you're not just there to keep track of rules and to delve out consequences. You're there to lead, to guide, to protect, to provide, to do all of these things that your taken in hand really counts on you for. And yes, mistakes are a part of life, and you've built in a system that allows you to hold your taken in hand accountable for their mistakes, but you also support them in their growth and you offer guidance for them so that they can grow and learn, and they don't have to be afraid of you just there kind of overseeing everything, just waiting for the moment they're going to make a mistake. They know that they can count on you, that they can come to you and ask for your input and your guidance so that they can have that growth overall. And so that's really the role of a head of household, is to guide and to grow and to facilitate that growth, as well as hold accountability. And so if you take on the role of head of household and you think it's just a disciplinarian role, you're really missing out on the richness of what the role of head of household encompasses. And you are going to create a situation with your taken in hand where you're limiting how you approach your relationship, and that will at least have the potential to break down the relationship overall. And so you really want to think about, what does it mean to be a head of household, and really show up to your relationship in the full capacity of what it means to lead and to guide. And so that's all I have to say. Again, if you want to support what we do and get bonus content, a link to our Patreon is down below. We'd love to have you join us over there. Until next time, talk to you later.